Some places are abandoned by people. Others are abandoned by the truth. The first bark echoed across the empty churchyard just as the afternoon light began to fade beneath a blanket of gray clouds. It was sharp, certain, nothing like the casual warning bark Ethan Walker heard whenever strangers approached his property. This one carried urgency, the kind that tightened something deep inside his chest before his mind could explain why. Ethan slowed his old Ford F-150 to the shoulder of the narrow county road and stared through the windshield at the forgotten church standing alone beyond a rusted iron gate. St. Matthew's had once been the heart of Ash Hollow, a farming community tucked into the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. Now it looked like time itself had stepped away. The white paint had long since surrendered to rain and winter winds. Ivy climbed the cracked stone walls. Half the stained glass windows were boarded shut, while the wooden bell tower leaned just enough to make every visitor wonder if the next strong storm would finally finish the job. No services had been held there in years. No lights ever burned after sunset. Even the birds seemed to avoid resting on its roof. Rex jumped from the truck before Ethan could reach for the leash. The 6-year-old German shepherd crossed the overgrown grass with deliberate steps, his ears locked forward, his amber eyes fixed on the weathered front entrance. He wasn't excited. He wasn't frightened. He looked like a soldier walking toward unfinished duty. Then he barked again. Once, twice, 3 times. Each bark struck the silent afternoon with unsettling precision. Ethan frowned. In the 6 years they had shared life together, Rex had never barked without reason. The dog had ignored squirrels, passing deer, noisy trucks, even thunderstorms that rattled windows across the valley. Silence was his nature. Observation was his instinct. If Rex raised his voice, something deserved attention. Ethan followed slowly, boots sinking into damp patches of moss that covered the old stone walkway. The air smelled of wet leaves, cedar, and aging wood. Somewhere nearby, wind stirred through towering oak branches, producing a low whisper that almost sounded like distant conversation. He rested one hand against the cold iron gate. Its hinges groaned softly as he pushed it open. "Easy, buddy," he said in a calm voice that carried years of military discipline. "What are you trying to show me?" Rex didn't look back. Instead, he moved past the church entrance without hesitation, circling along the side of the building until he reached the rear foundation where thick vines concealed much of the aging stone. There he stopped, completely still. His nose hovered inches above the ground. His muscles tightened. Then another bark burst from his chest, louder than before. Ethan searched the area carefully. Fallen branches, broken bricks, wildflowers forcing their way through forgotten cracks. Nothing unusual, nothing alive, nothing that should have held a German shepherd's complete attention. Yet Rex refused to move. Minutes slipped by. The breeze strengthened, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and old earth. Ethan crouched beside his companion, placing a weathered hand gently against the dog's shoulder. He felt the steady heartbeat beneath the thick sable coat. Not fear. Focus. Absolute certainty. As Ethan lifted his eyes toward the church, something caught his attention for the very first time. Every window was coated with years of dust except one. A narrow basement window, nearly hidden beneath tangled ivy, reflected a thin ribbon of fading sunlight, as though someone had wiped the glass clean not very long ago. Ethan remained kneeling beside Rex for several long seconds, watching the narrow basement window shimmer beneath the fading light. It looked ordinary at first glance, yet something about it unsettled him. Dust covered every other pane in the abandoned church, but this one reflected the evening sky with unexpected clarity. Someone, at some point, had touched that glass. The thought lingered quietly as he stood and brushed the damp earth from his jeans. "Come on, boy," he said gently. "We are not breaking into an old church." Rex did not obey. Instead, the German shepherd shifted his weight closer to the stone foundation and released a soft, restless whine. It was almost invisible as sound, more felt than heard, and Ethan recognized it immediately. Rex only made that sound when he believed something important was being overlooked. It reminded Ethan of another place years earlier, halfway around the world, where silence had often carried more danger than noise. Back then, trusting instinct had meant the difference between walking forward and walking away. Those lessons never completely left a Marine, even after the uniform did. Ethan had spent nearly 18 years serving his country before finally returning home to Western Pennsylvania. Friends often imagined veterans came home carrying medals and stories. Ethan had returned carrying quieter things. Sleepless nights, empty rooms, the habit of checking every doorway before entering. He had learned to live with those shadows one ordinary day at a time. Rex had become part of that healing almost by accident. 6 years earlier, while volunteering at a regional animal shelter, Ethan noticed a young German shepherd sitting silently in the farthest kennel. Other dogs barked, jumped, and begged for attention. That shepherd simply watched. Calm, patient, waiting. When Ethan stepped closer, the dog rose, walked forward, and gently rested his head against the chain-link gate without making a sound. Neither of them had chosen the other through excitement. They had recognized something familiar. Since then, they had rarely been apart. Morning hikes through pine forests, fishing trips along quiet streams, long evenings on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the hills. Rex never demanded attention. He only offered companionship, the kind that asked for nothing except honesty. More importantly, the dog had never once reacted without reason. Not once in 6 years. Ethan looked again toward the basement window. The reflection had faded now as thicker clouds gathered overhead, replacing golden light with the cool blue tones of approaching evening. A breeze slipped through broken branches, carrying the scent of rain mixed with old cedar beams and damp limestone. Somewhere inside the church, something shifted with a faint wooden creak. It could have been settling timbers. It could have been wind. Old buildings had their own language. Ethan knew that. Yet Rex's ears lifted higher, every muscle focused on the same unseen point beneath the sanctuary floor. Ethan finally clipped the leash onto the dog's collar. "We will come back tomorrow," he said quietly. In daylight, Rex hesitated before following, glancing over his shoulder twice as they walked toward the truck. Even after the engine started and the church slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, the German shepherd remained sitting upright, instead of lying across the back seat, as he usually did. His eyes never left the road behind them until the old bell tower vanished beyond the trees. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, he found himself checking the mirror one last time, wondering why it felt less like they were leaving the church and more like the church had quietly begun following them. Sleep came lightly that night, drifting in and out like fog rolling across the hills. Ethan woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because the house felt strangely awake. The old wooden floor settled beneath the cool morning air. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. Somewhere in the darkness, the coffee maker clicked as it finished brewing, filling the cabin with the familiar scent of roasted beans. Rex was already standing by the front door. His leash rested neatly on the floor beside him, untouched. Normally, the German shepherd greeted each morning with quiet patience, waiting for Ethan to finish his coffee before heading outside. Today there was no patience, only expectation. Ethan studied the dog for a long moment before shaking his head with a faint smile. "You are serious about this, are you not?" Rex answered only by looking toward the door. Less than 30 minutes later, the pickup rolled through the narrow roads leading back toward Ash Hollow. Thin mist floated above open fields where rows of harvested corn stretched toward distant tree lines. White fences glistened with dew. A pair of deer disappeared into the woods as the truck rounded another bend. Everything about the countryside felt peaceful, untouched by hurry. Yet Ethan could not shake the quiet weight pressing against his thoughts. He had driven these roads for years after returning home. He knew nearly every farmhouse, every creek crossing, every weathered mailbox leaning beside the pavement. The abandoned church had always been there, almost invisible from familiarity alone. Strange how something could hide in plain sight simply because everyone had stopped looking. Instead of turning directly toward the church, Ethan pulled into Miller's general store at the edge of town. The small brick building had served Ash Hollow for generations. A brass bell chimed as he stepped inside, bringing with it the comforting smell of fresh cinnamon rolls, sawdust, and old pine shelves polished by decades of use. Behind the counter stood Martha Collins, the store owner, a cheerful woman in her late 60s whose memory seemed sharper than the cash register she still refused to replace. She smiled when she saw Ethan. "Morning, stranger. It is good to see you before noon for once." Ethan laughed quietly. Rex decided we needed an early drive. Martha reached across the counter to scratch the German shepherd gently behind one ear. Rex accepted the greeting politely, but his attention drifted almost immediately toward the church road visible through the front window. Martha noticed. "That is unusual," she said softly. "He usually watches people, not buildings." Ethan hesitated before answering. "Has anything ever happened at St. Matthew's?" The smile on Martha's face faded just enough to reveal surprise. She glanced toward the empty aisle before lowering her voice. "People around here stopped asking about that place years ago." Ethan remained silent. He had learned long ago that silence often invited honesty better than questions. Martha folded a dish towel carefully across the counter. "4 years back, folks said someone disappeared around there. Sheriffs searched for days. Volunteers searched too. They never found much of anything except more questions. Eventually life moved on, like it always does in little towns." She looked toward Rex again. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, ears lifted toward the church road beyond the window, as though he had heard a voice no one else could hear. Martha exhaled slowly. "You know," she whispered, "old Pastor Samuel used to say that buildings remember things long after people forget them. I always thought that was just one of his sermons." Ethan thanked her, collected 2 cups of hot coffee to go, and walked back outside. As he opened the truck door, Rex climbed inside without hesitation. This time, however, Ethan noticed something new. The dog's nose was lifted into the morning breeze, searching, following a scent carried from somewhere beyond the abandoned church, and whatever he had found seemed older than yesterday, older than the rain itself, as though time had quietly left one final trail waiting to be discovered. By the time they reached the church again, the rain had stopped, leaving behind the clean scent of soaked pine needles and damp stone. Thin streams of water slipped from the edge of the leaning roof, tapping rhythmically onto the cracked flagstones below. The clouds were beginning to break apart, allowing narrow shafts of morning sunlight to filter through the towering oak trees that surrounded the old property. Everything appeared calm. Too calm. Ethan parked beneath an aging maple and stepped out with 2 cups of coffee balanced carefully in one hand. Before he could close the truck door, Rex was already moving. The German shepherd crossed the churchyard with steady purpose, never once looking toward the front entrance. He followed the exact same path as the day before, weaving through waist-high grass until he reached the rear foundation. Ethan glanced at his watch. It read exactly 4:17 in the afternoon the previous day when Rex had first begun barking. Now it was only a little after 9 in the morning. If the dog had been following a routine, today should have been different. Instead, Rex stopped in precisely the same place and lowered his nose toward the weathered stones. He did not bark immediately. He circled once, then twice, slowly, methodically, as though tracing an invisible pattern that had existed long before either of them arrived. Ethan watched every movement carefully. Military training had taught him to notice repetition because repetition usually meant intention. After several minutes, Rex completed another circle and sat facing the basement wall. His ears remained forward. His breathing slowed. Then he barked once. Only once. The sound echoed softly beneath the old church before fading into silence. Ethan walked closer, crouching beside the foundation. The limestone blocks were cold beneath his fingertips, their rough surfaces softened by decades of rain. Moss filled the narrow seams between the stones, and tangled ivy climbed almost to the basement window. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked new. Yet something caught his attention. Near the base of the wall, almost hidden beneath damp leaves, the grass grew differently. One narrow strip remained thinner than the surrounding ground, as though people had once walked across it many times before nature slowly reclaimed it. It was not a path anyone would notice while passing by. It simply refused to disappear completely. Ethan followed the faint line with his eyes until it vanished beneath a dense patch of blackberry bushes near the corner of the building. Rex stood immediately and walked toward the same spot without hesitation. He pushed gently through the branches, disappearing for only a second before emerging again, staring directly at Ethan. Not impatient, expectant. Ethan set the untouched coffee cups on an old stone bench and carefully parted the thorny vines. Hidden behind the overgrowth stood what appeared to be a weathered wooden cellar door built almost flush against the foundation. Years of leaves had gathered over its surface, blending it naturally into the landscape. Rust coated the iron hinges. A heavy chain wrapped loosely around the handles, but something immediately seemed unusual. The chain was badly corroded. The padlock attached to it was not. It looked several years newer than everything surrounding it, its dull gray surface marked by rain, but almost untouched by rust. Ethan frowned. Someone had secured this entrance long after the church itself had been abandoned. He reached forward and rested his hand against the cold metal without pulling it. At that exact moment, Rex stepped beside him, lifted his nose toward the damp morning air, and released the quietest whine Ethan had ever heard, as though whatever waited beneath those old wooden doors was no longer asking to stay hidden. For several seconds, Ethan simply stood there with his hand resting against the newer padlock, listening to the silence around him. It was not the peaceful silence he enjoyed while fishing on quiet mornings. This silence felt watchful, as though the old church had been holding its breath for years. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp cedar through the blackberry bushes, stirring loose leaves across the hidden cellar doors. Rex remained perfectly still beside him, his amber eyes fixed on the weathered wood. Ethan slowly removed his hand from the chain and stepped back. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him one lesson he never ignored. Curiosity was never a reason to force a locked door. Preparation came first. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. No signal. The screen showed only a lonely icon searching for a connection that never came. The thick woods surrounding the church had always interrupted reception, something the locals often joked about. Ethan slipped the phone away and examined the entrance more carefully instead. The chain hung loosely rather than tightly wrapped, almost as though its purpose was to discourage casual visitors instead of truly securing the doors. The wood itself looked remarkably solid despite its age. Someone had maintained it at some point. The edges were free from rot. The hinges, although stained by time, appeared capable of moving. That detail bothered him even more than the newer lock. Old buildings decayed unevenly. Neglected would usually soften first. This wood had endured. Ethan walked a slow circle around the foundation while Rex remained beside the cellar entrance. He searched for fresh footprints, but found only damp earth covered with pine needles and scattered acorns. No tire tracks reached this side of the property. No broken branches suggested recent visitors. Yet every few feet, he noticed another small inconsistency. One section of ivy had been cut cleanly instead of torn by weather. A rusted rain barrel stood beneath a broken gutter, but the lid, resting on top, looked carefully placed rather than abandoned. Even the weeds around the hidden doors seemed shorter than those growing elsewhere along the church walls. None of the details proved anything on their own. Together they whispered that someone had once cared enough to keep this forgotten corner from disappearing completely. Ethan returned to the cellar doors and crouched beside Rex. The German shepherd lowered his head until his nose almost touched the narrow gap where the two wooden panels met. He inhaled once, slowly, then lifted his gaze toward Ethan without barking. It was the same look he had given years ago before leading Ethan to an injured hiker lost in the Allegheny National Forest, a rescue that had happened almost by accident during a weekend trail walk. Rex had trusted his instincts then, and they had saved a life simply by refusing to turn back. Ethan smiled faintly as the memory surfaced. "You have earned my trust more times than I can count," he whispered. "So if you believe there is something here, I believe you." He stood and carefully lifted the loose chain from the handles. The metal clinked softly before settling against the damp wood. Only the padlock remained. Ethan examined it closely, turning it over in his hand without forcing it. On the underside, nearly hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt, were 4 small engraved numbers. 2, 0, 2, 2. The lock had been manufactured only 4 years earlier. Ethan felt the quiet weight of Martha's words return to him. For years. A disappearance. Questions that had never been answered. Before he could gather another thought, Rex suddenly shifted his attention away from the cellar doors and looked toward the woods behind the church. His ears stood tall. His body became rigid. Yet instead of barking, he simply watched, as though waiting for someone who had not arrived in a very long time. The woods remained perfectly still for nearly a minute. Ethan listened carefully, expecting the snap of a branch or the sound of approaching footsteps, but nothing disturbed the quiet except a pair of chickadees fluttering through the towering oaks. Rex never relaxed. His gaze stayed fixed between the trees, following something invisible until, just as suddenly as the tension had appeared, it faded. The German shepherd blinked once, lowered his head, and turned back toward the cellar doors. Ethan exhaled slowly. Whatever had captured the dog's attention was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there in the ordinary sense. He looked down at the engraved numbers on the padlock once more before carefully wrapping the chain back around the handles exactly as he had found it. If this place truly held the answer to a forgotten story, he wanted to approach it the right way. Forcing his way inside would only create more questions than answers. By late morning, the clouds had drifted east, leaving patches of blue stretching across the Pennsylvania sky. Ethan and Rex drove toward the Ash Hollow Historical Society, a modest brick building that had once served as the town library before being converted into a local archive. Few people visited anymore except genealogy enthusiasts and retired teachers searching through newspaper clippings. Inside, the scent of old paper, polished oak, and fading ink filled the quiet rooms. Shelves stood neatly arranged beneath tall windows where sunlight illuminated floating specks of dust. Behind a broad wooden desk sat Harold Bennett, an 80-year-old volunteer whose suspenders and neatly folded newspaper made him appear as though he belonged to another generation entirely. Harold looked over his reading glasses and smiled warmly when Ethan entered. "Well now, if it is not the Marine with the smartest dog in the county." Rex accepted the compliment with a slow wag of his tail before lying politely beside the desk. Ethan smiled. "I was hoping you might help me with something about St. Matthew's." The old man's smile softened into thoughtful silence. He removed his glasses and folded them carefully before speaking. "People usually come here asking about their grandparents. You are asking about the church." Ethan nodded. "I heard someone disappeared about 4 years ago." Harold leaned back in his chair and stared toward the ceiling for a long moment. "His name was Daniel Mercer," he finally said. 34 years old. A restoration. Carpenter from Pittsburgh. Good reputation. Quiet fellow. He came here after hearing the church might receive a preservation grant. He wanted to document the building before repairs began. Harold opened a worn filing cabinet and removed a thin manila folder. There was very little inside. A faded newspaper clipping. A photocopied missing person notice. A smiling photograph of a man standing beside a toolbox with sawdust on his flannel shirt. He checked into the old Willow Creek Motel on a Thursday, Harold continued. He told the owner he planned to spend 2 days measuring the church. Friday evening, he never returned. His truck was found parked near the cemetery entrance. His wallet, keys, and camera were still inside. Search teams combed these hills for nearly a week. Ethan studied the photograph carefully. Daniel's expression carried the easy confidence of someone who enjoyed building forgotten things back to life. There was nothing mysterious about him. Nothing that suggested he intended to vanish. "Did they ever search the church?" Ethan asked quietly. Harold nodded without hesitation. "They searched the sanctuary, the bell tower, every pew, every closet. Nothing unusual was found." He paused before adding one final sentence in a lower voice. "At least, that is what the official report said." Ethan looked up. Before he could ask another question, Rex quietly rose from the floor and walked toward a bulletin board hanging near the back wall. The German shepherd stopped beneath an old photograph of St. Matthew's taken decades earlier, lifted his nose, and stared at one small detail hidden near the edge of the picture. It was the side of the church, almost completely covered by vines, and just barely visible beneath the shadows was the outline of a wooden cellar entrance that no longer appeared on any modern map. Harold carefully removed the old photograph from the bulletin board and laid it across the reading table beneath the afternoon light. Time had faded the edges into soft shades of brown, but the church itself remained remarkably clear. Ethan leaned closer. The sanctuary looked almost unchanged except for one detail that immediately caught his attention. The vines climbing the southern wall were much shorter when the picture had been taken, leaving the cellar entrance completely exposed. A narrow stone path led directly to the wooden doors. "When was this taken?" Ethan asked. Harold adjusted his glasses before turning the photograph over. Written in careful blue ink across the back were only 3 words. Autumn Festival. October 1998. Harold nodded slowly. Back then the basement was still used for church dinners, food drives, and Christmas pageants. Folks stored folding tables, decorations, and canned goods down there. After the roof started leaking, they locked everything up. Eventually, everyone forgot the place even existed. Ethan studied the picture again. "Do you have the building plans?" Harold smiled faintly. "I thought you might ask." He disappeared into a storage room and returned several minutes later carrying a weathered cardboard tube tied with faded cotton string. Inside rested brittle architectural drawings dating back nearly 70 years. Ethan carefully unrolled them across the table, placing books along the corners to keep the paper flat. The sanctuary occupied the center of the design. Classrooms stretched along one side. Then his eyes reached the basement. According to the original blueprint, the cellar consisted of one large fellowship hall, 2 storage rooms, and a boiler room. Simple, practical. Yet another set of faint pencil markings had been added later in handwriting different from the printed plans. Someone had drawn a short dividing wall near the northern storage room and labeled it only with a single letter. C. There was no explanation, no revision date, no official signature. Just one mysterious addition that did not belong on the original design. Harold frowned. "I have looked at these plans for years. I never noticed that before." Ethan traced the penciled line gently with one finger. The graphite appeared lighter than the rest of the blueprint, almost as if someone had sketched it privately instead of during construction. "Could someone have remodeled the basement?" he asked. Harold shrugged. "Possible. Churches changed over time. Volunteers built shelves, added closets, moved walls. Most improvements were never recorded." Rex suddenly stood and walked around the table until he reached the lower edge of the blueprint. His nose hovered over the northern storage room, stopping directly above the hand-drawn partition. He looked at Ethan, then back at the drawing. Ethan could not help smiling despite the growing mystery. "You are becoming difficult to ignore." Harold chuckled softly. "Animals notice patterns we miss. Farmers have known that for centuries." Ethan carefully rolled the blueprint back into its tube before thanking Harold for his help. Less than an hour later, the truck returned once again to the churchyard beneath a sky now glowing with the warm gold of late afternoon. The shadows stretched longer across the grass, matching almost perfectly the angle shown in the old photograph. Rex wasted no time. He trotted directly through the blackberry bushes to the hidden cellar doors, stopping beside the newer padlock exactly as before. Ethan carried only a flashlight, a small notebook, work gloves, and a compact bolt cutter he kept in the truck for emergencies around his property. He stood quietly for a long moment, listening to the wind moving through the bell tower high above. Then he noticed something he had overlooked every previous visit. The padlock was closed, but it had never actually been snapped into place. The shackle rested loosely inside the latch, giving the appearance of being locked while leaving the chain free to open with the simplest touch. Ethan looked down at Rex. The German shepherd's tail remained perfectly still, but his eyes shone with calm certainty, as though he had been waiting all along for Ethan to discover that the first barrier had never truly been a barrier at all. With slow, deliberate movements, Ethan lifted the loose padlock from the chain and set it carefully on the ground. The metal landed with a dull click that seemed unusually loud beneath the quiet afternoon sky. He unwound the chain from the weathered handles and pulled gently. At first, the cellar doors refused to move, their swollen wood resisting years of damp seasons. Then, with a deep groan that echoed beneath the church foundation, they opened just enough to release a breath of cool, stale air that smelled of old timber, limestone, and forgotten winters. Rex did not rush inside. That surprised Ethan more than anything else. Instead, the German shepherd stood at the top of the narrow stone staircase, ears forward, patiently waiting for Ethan to lead. It was almost as though the dog understood that whatever rested below belonged first to human hands and human eyes. Ethan switched on his flashlight. A bright white beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone steps disappearing into shadow. Dust floated lazily through the light like tiny drifting stars. Cobwebs stretched between exposed ceiling beams. Water dripped somewhere deeper inside with slow, steady rhythm. One careful step followed another. Ethan kept one hand against the rough stone wall while the flashlight swept across the basement. The room was larger than he expected. Folding tables leaned neatly against one wall. Metal chairs stood stacked in orderly rows beneath faded canvas covers. Shelves filled with cracked hymn books, empty mason jars, and dusty Christmas decorations lined the far side of the fellowship hall. Nothing appeared overturned. Nothing suggested panic or struggle. It looked less like a forgotten basement and more like a room quietly paused in time. Rex descended behind him without making a sound. His nails clicked softly against the stone steps before falling silent on the concrete floor below. The dog moved slowly across the open room, sniffing with calm precision rather than excitement. Ethan noticed how little dust covered certain areas. Most surfaces wore a thick gray blanket collected over many years, yet narrow pathways between shelves appeared noticeably cleaner, as though someone had once walked there often before time gradually erased the evidence. The flashlight drifted toward an old cast-iron furnace, standing silent in one corner. Beside it rested a wooden workbench scattered with rusted hand tools, paintbrushes, and empty coffee cans. A faded calendar still hung on the wall above the bench. Its pages remained open to September, though the year had long since faded beyond recognition. Ethan slowly turned in a full circle, comparing the room before him with the blueprint stored inside his jacket. Everything matched surprisingly well. The fellowship hall, the storage shelves, the boiler room doorway. Then he looked north. According to the plans, another storage room should have opened beyond a short hallway. Instead, his flashlight revealed something entirely different. A smooth wooden wall stretched across the corridor from floor to ceiling. Fresh enough to appear decades newer than the surrounding stone, it blended neatly into the basement as though it had always belonged there. Simple pine boards. Careful craftsmanship. No windows. No sign. Just a wall standing exactly where Harold's mysterious pencil markings had suggested one might exist. Ethan approached slowly. He pressed one gloved hand against the wood. It felt solid, well-built, far sturdier than a temporary partition should have been. Rex joined him and lowered his nose near the bottom corner where the boards met the concrete floor. He inhaled once before lifting his head toward Ethan. There was no bark this time, only quiet certainty. Ethan tapped lightly against the boards with his knuckles. Most of the wall answered with a heavy, solid sound. Then, near the center, one section responded differently. Hollow, barely noticeable, just enough to stop him from knocking again. He swept the flashlight upward and finally noticed something hidden almost perfectly within the grain of the pine. A narrow brass handle, no larger than the palm of his hand, had been stained to match the wood so carefully that it disappeared unless the light struck it from exactly the right angle. Ethan wrapped his fingers around the small brass handle and hesitated. Years of service had taught him that hesitation was not fear. It was respect for the unknown. He glanced down at Rex. The German shepherd stood close at his side, calm and steady, his amber eyes fixed on the hidden panel. There was no tension in his posture now, only quiet assurance. Ethan drew a slow breath and pulled gently. The wooden section did not resist. It swung inward almost silently, revealing a narrow room concealed behind the false wall. The beam from his flashlight swept across the space, and Ethan immediately realized this was not another storage closet. It was too clean, too carefully arranged. A simple wooden desk stood against one wall beneath a small ventilation window no larger than a notebook. Beside it rested a narrow cot covered with a neatly folded gray blanket. A lantern sat on a shelf beside several empty glass jars and a rainwater container fitted with a small filter. A compact camping stove occupied the far corner beside stacked boxes labeled with dates from several years earlier. Dust covered every surface, but nothing appeared overturned or abandoned in panic. It looked as though someone had quietly stood up one ordinary day, closed the hidden door behind them, and never returned. Rex stepped inside first, moving slowly around the room without disturbing anything. He sniffed the cot, the desk, and finally stopped beside a small wooden chair tucked beneath the work table. Ethan approached carefully. The desk held only a few ordinary items at first glance. A pair of reading glasses rested beside a dried fountain pen. An old mechanical watch lay frozen at 3:28. A ceramic coffee mug still sat on a faded coaster decorated with blue wildflowers. Everything suggested routine rather than emergency. Then Ethan noticed a leather-bound journal resting neatly in the center of the desk, protected beneath a folded linen cloth. The cover had cracked with age, but the initials pressed into the leather remained visible. D.M. Ethan's heartbeat slowed as he gently lifted the journal into the flashlight beam. Daniel Mercer. The missing carpenter. Ethan opened the cover with both hands. Inside, The first pages contain measurements of stained glass windows, sketches of roof beams, and careful restoration notes written in neat handwriting. Nothing unusual, but several pages later the tone changed completely. The entries became personal. Daniel wrote about hearing strange sounds beneath the church after sunset. He mentioned discovering building alterations that were missing from official records. One sentence had been underlined twice. Someone wanted this room forgotten long before I found it. Ethan continued, turning the pages. The handwriting remained steady, never frantic, never confused. Daniel described choosing to stay hidden inside the concealed room after realizing that someone had repeatedly entered the church at night. He believed leaving too soon might allow important evidence to disappear forever. He planned to document everything before contacting authorities. Ethan stopped at the final completed entry. The date matched exactly 4 years earlier. The words were calm despite their weight. Tomorrow I will leave before sunrise. If these notes are found, please know that I stayed because the truth deserved at least one witness. After that page, every remaining sheet was blank. Ethan lowered the journal slowly, the silence pressing more heavily than before. Daniel had not vanished without purpose. He had uncovered something important enough to remain hidden, yet whatever he had intended to reveal had never reached another soul. Rex quietly walked behind the desk and sat facing the stone wall at the back of the concealed room. He looked upward instead of forward. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze, raising the flashlight until the beams settled upon a simple wooden cross hanging alone above the desk. At first it appeared ordinary. Then the light caught a tiny brass hinge attached to one side. For a long moment Ethan simply stared at the small wooden cross mounted above the desk. It was beautifully carved from dark walnut, its edges worn smooth by careful hands rather than age alone. The brass hinge hidden along one side caught the flashlight only because Rex had drawn his attention upward. Without the dog's quiet insistence, Ethan would have walked past it without a second thought. He stepped closer and reached toward the cross with slow, respectful movements. It swung open like the cover of a tiny cabinet. Inside rested a shallow compartment no larger than a paperback book. There was no jewelry, no money, no forgotten relic. Instead, a thick manila envelope lay carefully protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. Across the front, written in Daniel Mercer's unmistakably careful handwriting, were 7 simple words. If found, please give this to Sheriff Collins. Ethan removed the envelope gently and examined the seal. It had never been opened. Time had yellowed the edges, but the adhesive remained intact. He hesitated only a moment before breaking it carefully. Several documents slid onto the desk beneath the beam of his flashlight. The first pages contained photographs Daniel had taken during his restoration work. Most showed ordinary details of the aging church. Roof beams, foundation stones, damaged stained glass. But several photographs focused on the hidden basement wall before it had been concealed. Ethan noticed stacks of old record boxes lining the original storage room. Another photograph showed handwritten ledgers spread across a table. Daniel had written notes beneath each image, identifying them as financial records belonging to the church dating back more than 30 years. The next document explained everything. During his inspection, Daniel had discovered that the church trustees had quietly hidden decades of historical records inside the concealed room after repeated burglaries struck neighboring towns. The documents included land deeds, veterans' memorial donations, scholarship funds, baptism records, marriage certificates, and letters written by families whose loved ones had served overseas. The room had never been created to hide anything illegal. It had been built years earlier to protect irreplaceable history until proper preservation could be arranged. Daniel believed someone feared the records might disappear forever if the abandoned church continued collapsing. Ethan continued reading. The final pages revealed why Daniel never came home. During his work, severe storms had damaged the old exterior cellar entrance, causing fallen debris to block the hidden doors from the outside. Daniel had written that he remained safe inside the concealed room for several days using stored supplies while searching for another exit. He eventually discovered a narrow ventilation shaft leading toward the bell tower, but it was too small to climb through. His final journal entry had ended with hope, convinced someone would eventually notice his truck and continue searching. They never searched behind the false wall because no one knew it existed. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of 4 forgotten years settling quietly around him. This had never been a story of cruelty. It had been a story of silence, coincidence, and a hidden room that no investigation had ever uncovered. Rex stepped closer and gently rested his head against Ethan's arm without making a sound. Ethan reached down and stroked the thick fur behind the dog's ears. "You did not bring me here to find a mystery," he whispered softly. "You brought me here to finish someone else's promise." Just then, a faint breeze drifted through the small ventilation opening above the desk, carrying with it the distant sound of the old church bell moving ever so slightly in the wind. It did not ring. It simply swayed once, releasing the softest note into the quiet afternoon, as though the building itself finally knew its long-kept story had found someone willing to carry it back into the light. The sun had already slipped behind the western ridge by the time Ethan and Rex emerged from the hidden room beneath the church. Evening settled gently across Ash Hollow, painting the old stone walls in soft shades of amber and blue. Ethan secured the concealed door exactly as he had found it, carefully replacing every chair, every journal, every photograph, and every document except the sealed evidence Daniel had intended for Sheriff Collins. Some promises deserved to be delivered exactly as they had been written. Less than an hour later, the headlights of the pickup rolled quietly into the parking lot beside the Ash Hollow Sheriff's office. Sheriff Benjamin Collins, now approaching retirement after more than 3 decades in law enforcement, looked up from his desk as Ethan entered carrying the weathered envelope. The older man's friendly smile slowly faded when his eyes settled on Daniel Mercer's name written across the front. He accepted the package with both hands, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he stared silently at the familiar handwriting for several long seconds before speaking. "I remember his parents waiting outside this very office every Friday afternoon for months," he said softly. "They never stopped believing someone would find an answer." Ethan nodded. "I think we finally did." Inside the conference room, Sheriff Collins carefully unfolded every page while Ethan explained everything exactly as it had happened, never adding assumptions where facts were enough. He described the concealed room, Daniel's journal, the hidden archive, and the untouched records preserved beneath the church. Collins listened without interruption. When he reached the final journal entry, he removed his glasses and quietly rubbed his eyes before reading the last lines once more. "He stayed because he believed history mattered," the sheriff whispered. "He trusted that someone would eventually finish what he started." By the following morning, a small team, including county preservation officials, structural engineers, and historical archivists, gathered at St. Matthew's. They entered carefully, documenting every corner of the concealed room exactly as Daniel had left it. The discovery astonished everyone. Thousands of church records believed permanently lost had survived untouched behind the false wall. Military memorial donations dating back generations, handwritten family Bibles, photographs of hometown service members, children's Christmas programs, letters sent home during wars, and records connecting hundreds of local families to their forgotten past had all remained safely protected. News traveled through Ash Hollow with remarkable speed. People who had not spoken about St. Matthew's in years found themselves gathering outside the old gates once again. Elderly residents pointed toward names preserved inside the ledgers. Parents brought children to show them photographs of great-grandparents they had never known. What had begun as a forgotten mystery slowly became something far more meaningful. It became a reunion between an entire town and its own history. Late that afternoon, an older couple arrived quietly at the church. Daniel Mercer's parents stepped through the open doors carrying only a bouquet of white lilies. Sheriff Collins met them beside the sanctuary and handed them their son's journal with both hands. No speeches were necessary. No dramatic words filled the silence. Daniel's mother simply held the worn leather cover against her heart, while his father looked toward the afternoon sunlight pouring through the restored, stained glass windows. "He always believed old places deserved another chance," his father said with a gentle smile. Ethan stood several steps away beside Rex, giving the family the privacy they deserved. The German shepherd watched them calmly before lifting his gaze toward the bell tower high above. A warm breeze drifted across the churchyard, stirring the newly trimmed ivy climbing the stone walls. Somewhere overhead, the old bell moved gently once again, not with sadness this time, but with the quiet dignity of something finally remembered after far too many years of silence. 2 weeks later, the church no longer looked forgotten. Work crews had repaired loose roof shingles, trimmed away years of tangled ivy, and carefully stabilized the leaning bell tower without changing its character. Fresh cedar replaced only the boards that could no longer be saved. The worn stone walls remained exactly as they had always been, carrying every season they had endured with quiet dignity. Volunteers from Ash Hollow arrived each morning carrying paintbrushes, ladders, flower boxes, and homemade lunches. Teenagers worked beside retirees. Farmers stood beside schoolteachers. Families who had not spoken to one another in years found themselves sorting old photographs together beneath the sanctuary windows. The hidden archive had done more than preserve history. It had reminded an entire town that they had once shared one. Ethan visited only when someone asked for help moving heavy furniture or repairing damaged wood. He never considered himself the hero of the story. Every time someone thanked him, he smiled politely before looking down at Rex. "You are thanking the wrong partner," he would say. The German shepherd accepted every kind hand and gentle pat with quiet humility before returning to Ethan's side. The endless barking had disappeared completely. It was as though the purpose that had guided him to the church had finally been fulfilled. One cool Saturday morning, Pastor Michael Hayes from a neighboring community held the first gathering inside St. Matthew's in more than 5 years. It was not announced as a formal church service. Instead, it was simply called a morning of gratitude. Folding chairs filled the old sanctuary once again. Sunlight poured through the restored stained glass, painting soft colors across the wooden floor where children sat beside grandparents listening to stories preserved inside Daniel Mercer's journal. Sheriff Collins spoke briefly about responsibility. Harold Bennett shared memories of Christmas dinners held in the basement decades earlier. Martha Collins laughed through happy tears as she pointed toward photographs she had not seen since childhood. Daniel Mercer's parents sat quietly in the front pew holding the leather journal that had finally come home. They asked for no recognition. Seeing their son's careful handwriting preserved inside the church he had tried to protect was enough. Near the end of the gathering, Pastor Hayes invited Ethan to say a few words. Ethan stood slowly, glanced around the sanctuary, then looked toward Rex lying peacefully near the first row of pews. He smiled before speaking. "I spent many years believing courage meant charging toward danger. The Marines taught me discipline. Life taught me patience. But this dog reminded me of something even more important." He paused as Rex quietly lifted his head. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to walk away when something does not feel finished. The sanctuary remained silent. No applause interrupted the moment. None was needed. As everyone stepped outside afterward, the afternoon breeze carried the familiar scent of pine, fresh-cut grass, and rain-soaked earth across the churchyard. Children chased butterflies between newly planted flowers while older neighbors stood reading the names engraved on a restored veterans memorial beside the entrance. Ethan and Rex wandered toward the rear of the property where the hidden cellar doors remained carefully preserved beneath their covering of ivy, now marked only inside the official building records so they would never again be forgotten. Rex paused for a brief moment at the place where he had first begun barking. He looked toward the stone foundation, then quietly turned away without stopping. Ethan rested a hand against the dog's broad shoulder as they walked together toward the waiting truck. For the first time since they had arrived at St. Matthew's, Rex never once looked back. Autumn settled gently over Ash Hollow, turning the hills into quiet waves of crimson, gold, and deep amber. Weeks passed, then months, and life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Farmers harvested their fields before sunrise. Children filled the school buses each weekday morning. The bell at St. Matthew's rang every Sunday once again, its warm voice drifting across the valley instead of fading into silence. People often spoke about the remarkable discovery beneath the church, but as time moved forward, the conversations became less about mystery and more about gratitude. The restored archives found a permanent home inside the County Historical Museum, where families could read letters written by grandparents they had never met, study faded photographs rescued from forgotten boxes, and trace generations of quiet kindness preserved on fragile pages. Daniel Mercer's journal occupied a simple glass display near the entrance. Beneath it rested a small brass plaque engraved with a single sentence taken from his final entry. The truth deserves at least one witness. Visitors paused there longer than they expected. Some smiled softly. Others wiped away quiet tears. Ethan rarely visited the museum. Recognition had never interested him. Peace did. Most mornings he and Rex returned to the familiar hiking trails that wound through the pine forests outside town. They walked without hurry, stopping beside clear streams where trout rested beneath smooth stones and morning mist drifted between towering evergreens. Sometimes Ethan carried coffee in a weathered thermos. Sometimes he carried nothing at all. Rex always walked a few steps ahead, glancing back every so often just to make certain his friend was still there. One cool October evening, they found themselves overlooking the valley from a rocky ridge where the entire town could be seen below. The restored church stood quietly among the trees, its white steeple catching the last rays of the setting sun. Ethan sat on an old fallen log while Rex settled beside him, leaning gently against his leg the way he always had after long walks. Neither of them spoke, yet the silence no longer carried unanswered questions. It carried contentment. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on the thick fur along Rex's neck. "You heard something I never could," he whispered. "Not a sound. A promise." Rex lifted his head toward the fading sky, his ears catching the distant ringing of the church bell floating across the valley on the evening breeze. This time he did not bark. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though recognizing that the voice calling him had finally grown quiet. Ethan smiled to himself. During his years in the Marines, he had learned that strength often meant enduring hardship without complaint. Yet the dog beside him had taught a different lesson. Sometimes strength meant refusing to ignore the smallest sign that something was unfinished. Sometimes loyalty was not measured by how fiercely someone fought, but by how patiently they waited until the truth found its way home. The first stars appeared above the darkening hills as the last light disappeared beyond the horizon. Ethan rose, adjusted his jacket against the cool evening air, and started back down the trail with Rex walking faithfully beside him. Behind them, St. Matthew's stood peacefully beneath the autumn sky, no longer remembered as a place of unanswered questions, but as a place where hope had quietly outlived silence. And somewhere between the steady rhythm of two sets of footsteps and the distant ringing of an old church bell, it became clear that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they arrive on four steady paws, asking only that someone listens long enough for a forgotten promise to be kept.